Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I must begin by acknowledging the Minister who was in the chair during the committee stage for his very prompt and complete answer to the question I posed as to the number of victims who had been compensated under the terms of this bill in the previous 5 years and the amount of that compensation. I'm now informed that a total of $25,000 has been awarded to victims as reparations, and a total of 4 victims have been awarded a total of $38,000 under the provisions of this bill. So we now know that in 5 years, some $65,000 has found its way into the hands of victims in total, who otherwise would have received nothing. That is an extraordinarily small amount of money. My expectations were not high. I have not been disappointed in those expectations. I would have thought it not beyond the wit of this House to come up with a mechanism that would deliver a great deal more real, practical compensation to victims than a very paltry $65,000 over 5 years. It seems hardly worth the time of this House to extend the life of this Act in order to perpetuate a piece of legislation that has clearly failed in its intention to return even a small amount of compensation to victims. Clearly, the Greens and the Māori Party are alone tonight in this House in terms of our opposition to the extension of this Act through this bill. But we know that there are others outside this House who support the position we are taking. And we know this not only in part through the submissions that were made to the Select Committee. And I'd like to quote from a couple of those submissions. And firstly, from Caritas, the Agency for Justice, Peace, Development, the social services arm of the Catholic Church in New Zealand. They're quite clear, to quote the submission, Caritas opposes this bill. We originally opposed the 2005 Act on which it is based because victims of crime will only benefit and be compensated if the offender is mistreated by the state and awarded compensation as a result of this mistreatment. A point that's been made tonight, it's a very perverse mechanism to award compensation to a victim only if the human rights of another person, an inmate, have been transgressed. It is a very strange daisy chain, a very peculiar mechanism for delivering compensation to people. The Caritas submission goes on to say that they believe under this legislation that few prisoners will pursue complaints of abuse and violence, and even fewer victims are likely to receive compensation payments. And clearly that expectation is borne out by the history of the last 5 years, a very paltry $65,000 of benefit. Caritas further points out that there is no incentive for prisoners to be compliant with prison authorities. A situation in prisons is created where there is nothing left to lose, and that the Act creates an environment where prisons are potentially more dangerous, and the extension of those provisions on this bill repeats that risk. So again, an organisation who is not self-interested, with no axe to grind, an organisation only concerned with peace and justice in this country, who are making very clear, well-informed statements that this is not legislation that is worthy of extension. It has no value in it. The Human Rights Commission, in its submission, did support the continuation of that Act, but only rather tentatively on the grounds that an assumption that there would be a full review of this legislation and that by 2012 we would have legislation in place that is more compatible, to use their language, with Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Because in the body of their submission, they make the point that in their opinion that the process of awarding compensation in this Act does not amount to an effective remedy in terms of Article 2 of that Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They go on to say that proposals to deal with this, the capacity crisis in our prisons, such mechanisms as double bunking, 2 to a cell, these are short-term remedies and likely to increase the number of human rights issues that are needing to be dealt with and the likelihood of transgression of human rights, and go on to say that the state faces few adverse consequences when it fails to meet its obligation to prisoners under this legislation. The Law Society, again, an organisation that can't be trifled with to an extent, a highly credible organisation with a long history of analysis and commentary on legislation and law. They note that in 2005 the Society opposed the Act being enacted at that time. They quote the United Nations Committee Against Torture having expressed concern that the 2005 Act limits the award and payment of compensation to prisoners. And the Society agrees with the Minister of Justice, quoting, that the best way of preventing future claims arising from breaches of prisoners' human rights is to ensure that incidents leading to such claims are kept to an absolute minimum. Would it not be more sensible to put our energy and efforts into minimising, reducing the offences against inmates while they are in prison to get that unlovely proposition out of the way? Would it not make a great deal more sense to put effort into finding and applying the known mechanisms for reducing crime, reducing recidivism, therefore reducing the number of victims, finding real mechanisms, restorative justice processes, which will enable victims to feel that they have experienced some closure, some compensation, be it of a financial sort, or simply to be able to let go of the trauma, the emotional, mental and occasionally physical trauma that does result from crime. We know programs are in place that work. The Sycamore Tree program, working with high-end offenders, that has achieved remarkable outcomes in turning around the lives and giving victims an opportunity to see that their concerns have been heard, that their issues have at least been confronted by the perpetuator of the crime against them. I mentioned earlier the Faith Unit that manages to deal with some 60 people a year, but probably could offer useful service and better outcomes for some 2,000 prisoners, is the estimate of the Prison Fellowship. Some 2,000 prisoners would get benefit, would improve their behaviours, reduce their likelihood of recidivism if they were able to get access to programs of that nature. We know the solutions at work. This bill is not one of them. The Act that it seeks to extend is not part of the solution. It is part of that problem, and for that reason we will vote against this legislation. Kia ora.